Electoral fact-finding missions aim to assess the state of preparedness of the electoral process, including the readiness of the election management body and other key stakeholders. In this regard, the missions held consultations with the Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, African Integration, and Ivorians living abroad, the Minister of Defense, the President and members of the Constitutional Council, the Independent Electoral Commission, the National Commission on Human Rights, the High Authority of Audiovisual Communications, HACA, and the National Press Authority. The delegations also engaged political parties, including the Democratic Party of Côte d'Ivoire, African Democratic Rally, the PDCI-RDA, the Coalition for Political Change in Côte d'Ivoire, CAPCI, the African People's Party of Côte d'Ivoire, the PPA-CI, and the Rally of Officiers for Democracy and Peace, the RHDP. In addition, the missions held discussions with religious and traditional leaders, civil society organizations, and several other NGO platforms, coalitions, NGO platforms and coalitions, the diplomatic corps, and the international community present in Côte d'Ivoire. 3. In the build-up to the 25th October 2025 election, and in furtherance of the provisions of Article 14 to 16 of the Supplementary Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, and Article 2, subsection 12 of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, the President of ECOWAS, His Excellency Omar Aliou Touré, and the Chairperson of the AU Commission, His Excellency Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, jointly deployed an election observation mission, EOM, comprising 15 long-term and 240 short-term observers to Côte d'Ivoire. The joint mission was led by Professor Yemi Osinbajo, former Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, with the support of His Excellency Babako Blaise Diagne, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Gambia, and His Excellency Mohamed Saleh Anadif, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Chad, and former Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General and head of UNOWAS. The mission was supported by a technical team from the ECOWAS Commission and Africa Union Commission, led by the ECOWAS Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, Ambassador Abdel Fattah Musa, and the African Union Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, Ambassador Bankole Adeoye. The Joint Election Observation Mission was deployed with a mandate to observe all critical phases of the electoral process before, during, and after the election, with a view to assessing the process and preferring recommendations aimed at strengthening and improving future electoral processes. Furthermore, the EOM serves as a rapid response mechanism for preventive diplomacy initiatives on electoral process-related challenges. The membership of the joint mission is drawn from 28 African countries, comprising the ECOWAS and African Union parliaments, the ECOWAS Community Court of Justice, the ECOWAS and Africa Union Permanent Representatives Committees, the ECOWAS Council of the Wise, the African Union Panel of the Foreign Affairs Ministries and electoral management bodies of member states, as well as civil society organizations, media, and electoral experts. Of the October 2025 presidential election. The presidential election of the 25th of October 2025 in Côte d'Ivoire is a decisive turning point in the country's democratic consolidation process. The electoral crisis of 2010 and 2020, the 25th October election constitutes a test of the country's ability to conduct a peaceful, credible, and violence-free electoral process. In the weeks leading up to the polls, approximately 700 individuals were reportedly arrested for alleged public order disturbances. About 30 of them were tried and sentenced to jail terms of up to 3 years imprisonment for participating in, quotes, banned demonstrations. From a socio-economic perspective, Côte d'Ivoire remains relatively stable, with notable economic performance despite persistent social inequalities amongst the populace. Besides, persistent disagreements over the revision of the voters' register, among others, led to the suspension of the participation of some opposition parties, such as the PPA-CI and the PDCI, in the Independent Electoral Commission's deliberations. Allegations concerning the credibility of the voters' register, combined with weak political dialogues, contributed to heightened tensions and apprehension. Opposition parties consequently questioned the Electoral Commission's capacity to organize free and fair elections. In a similar vein, the disqualification of several prominent opposition figures, including Laurent Gbagbo, former president, and Tidjane Thiam, heightened perceptions of electoral partiality. Whilst the Constitutional Council asserted that these exclusions were the Constitution and existing laws, supporters of excluded candidates claimed that such decisions undermine inclusiveness and overall credibility of the process. Furthermore, most of the prospective presidential candidates were disqualified as a result of their inability to satisfy sponsorship requirements, leaving 5 candidates out of 60 to contest the elections. This has also been a source of grievance, especially amongst the opposition parties and their supporters. But despite the foregoing, the election campaign period, which began on the 10th of October 2025, ended at midnight on the 23rd of October 2025, with little reported incidents, save the burning of the Electoral Commission office in Yamoussoukro and the killing of a gendarme during a patrol mission on the Agueville-Azagwe axis, which incident occurred on Monday, 20th of October 2025. Also, on Sunday, 19th October 2025, a protester arrested during the dismantling of barricades on the Daloa-Isia axis, the center-west, died of shortness of breath, in quotes, after being evacuated to the hospital. In the country, leading up to the election day, was relatively calm. The legal framework of the election. An ideal legal framework is one that is easily accessible and transparent, with consistent and easily applicable provisions to promote democracy and ensure the rule of law. The Ivorian legal framework for the presidential election is accessible and largely complies with international standards. It's also aligned with international regional and sub-regional instruments, which were ratified by Côte d'Ivoire. It includes the 2016 Constitution, as amended on March the 19th, 2020, and the Electoral Code, as modified in April 2020 and May 2025. It is supplemented by other texts, such as the 1993 Law on Political Parties, the 2004 Law on the Funding of Political Parties and Groups and Election Campaigns, as well as various decrees issued by the Council of Ministers. And these include notably Decree number 2025/649 of July the 30th of 2025, which convenes the electorate to the polls for the 25th of October 2025 presidential election and the various communiques from the Independent Electoral Commission. In addition to legal texts, the resolutions from political dialogues constitute a part of the uncodified legal framework that plays a role in the organization of presidential elections in Côte d'Ivoire. According to Article 55 of the Constitution, eligibility for the presidential election is conditioned on having Ivorian nationality exclusively, being born to an Ivorian father or mother of origin, being at least 35 years old, and enjoying one's civil and political rights. In addition, candidates must be sponsored by voters representing 1% of the local electorate in at least 50% of the regions and autonomous districts. If after verification by the Constitutional Council, a candidate no longer meets the required minimum, the candidate is notified to regularize the number of invalidated sponsorships within 48 hours. This is Article 54 of the Electoral Code. The Joint Mission noted that some aspects of sponsorship by voters deserve further clarification by the Electoral Code. Engagement with stakeholders. Upon arrival in Abidjan on the 20th of October 2025, the head of mission and his delegation held consultations with relevant stakeholders on the electoral process, including with the President of the Republic and the RHDP's candidate, His Excellency Alassane Ouattara, and other candidates such as Ahoa Don Melo, the independent candidate, Mrs. Henrietta Adjoa Lago, candidate of the Groupement des Partenaires Politiques pour la Paix, GPP. The mission equally held consultations with the Minister of the Interior, the Independent Electoral Commission, CEI, the High Authority for the Audiovisual Communication, HACA, and the RHDP, the Constitutional Council, and the National Press Authority. The mission also held consultations with a group of African ambassadors in Côte d'Ivoire and ambassadors of the European Union, civil society organizations, as well as other heads of international election observation missions, including the OIF, l'Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, and the West African Elders Forum. Election Day. On Election Day, the Joint Mission deployed a total of 255 observers, grouped into 88 observer teams, covering all 12 administrative districts, in addition to the autonomous districts of Abidjan and Yamoussoukro. The observers visited a combined total of 1,477 polling stations, 1,477 polling stations nationwide, and they reported the following. During the opening phase of the polls, the mission observed 88 polling stations across multiple districts and municipalities in Côte d'Ivoire on the 25th of October 2025. Overall, the opening process was peaceful and orderly, with adequate security personnel present in most areas. Of the 88 polling stations observed, 67.79% opened on time, while 32.20% experienced delays ranging from 10 minutes to over an hour. The Joint Mission noted that several factors accounted for the delays in the opening. These included logistical challenges, causing late delivery of voting materials. In some locations, materials arrived nearly an hour after 8 a.m., the official opening of polling, resulting in a late start to voting. In addition, some polling centers experienced difficulties in setting up and getting the staff ready before the opening time. In other places, observers noted equipment malfunction, particularly affecting the biometric verification machines. Among the polling stations that experienced delayed delivery of materials were Bundiali in Savanes District, EPP Coco 1, BV01, and Bongwanu in the Lax District, then the Lycée Modern BV01, Yamasukro Atie Guakro, EPP and Debo BV02, and the Adzope in Lagunas District, Group Scolaire 123 at Maternal BV5. Observers also noted the absence or late arrival of polling officials in some polling stations, and this contributed to the delays in the commencement of polls. For instance, in Makori, the GS Sombo Isaac BV02, Makori in the Groupe Scolaire Boulevard du Gabon BV04, and Abidjan, the Lycée Technique BV4. Presiding officers and other essential staff were not on site at the start of polls, thus delaying the polls by nearly an hour. Furthermore, the relocation of the polling center number 39 from EPP Mahidio to GS Henriette Dagri Diabate, polling center number 04 in Gagnoa on the morning of election day before voting began led to a delayed setup and caused initial confusion among voters who were unaware of the relocation. In summary, while most polling stations opened on time, about 1/3 of polling stations experienced delays due to late delivery of materials, late arrival of election officials, organizational and logistical deficiencies, and lack of communication on a relocated polling center in Ganoa. It's also worth noting the near total absence of representatives from 4 candidates at the polling stations, notably those of Jean-Louis Bion, Simone Gbagbo, and Henriette Lagu, and Ahua Don Melo. This was in sharp contrast to the presence of agents of candidate Alassane Ouattara in almost all polling stations visited. The Joint Mission observed a total of 1,360 polling stations across all major districts and regions in the country. Overall, the voting exercise was peaceful and well organized in a majority of polling stations observed. Out of the total number observed, 92% were rated as having good or excellent conduct of the voting process, while 8% recorded notable challenges, primarily related to access to secrecy of ballot or voter management. There were isolated incidents of tension, which were non-violent, in Boaké, in the Vallée du Bandama district, the GS Nimbo BV4, and Yopougon Abidjan district, the GS Sidechi BAD BV5, both relating to overcrowding during peak voting hours. However, none of these incidents disrupted voting operations. Moreover, there was adequate presence of security officials who acted professionally in discharging their responsibilities at polling centers. While most stations ensured privacy, about 61 polling stations had a layout that compromised ballot secrecy due to inadequate spacing or improper booth positioning. Examples include EPP Sikogi BV2 in Boaké and EPP Coco 1 BV3 in Bundiali. In addition, although most polling stations had adequate electoral materials, there were isolated places, such as in Abobo in the Abidjan district, Lycée Moderne 2 and BV7, which recorded insufficient indelible ink. In Gagnoa, in the Go-Jiboa district, in Lycée Moderne 1, BV4, where there were missing tactile ballots and delays in replenishing ballot papers. Also in Divo, in the Go-Jiboa district, in the Collège Moderne in Divo BV8. Concerning inclusion, accessibility at the polling stations was generally fair, but limited in several polling stations observed. For instance, in 234 polling stations, representing 25%, had challenges such as stairs or narrow entrances, making accessibility very difficult. Notable examples include Cocody in Abidjan, San Pedro in the Bas Sassandra district, where polling units in school buildings lacked ramps for easy access. In addition, some polling stations were also located on upper floors of buildings, as observed in Port Boy. Tactile ballots for visually impaired voters were rarely available, present in only 95 polling stations, 12%, and used in fewer than 10 polling stations. Despite these limitations, the mission noted that election staff showed willingness to accommodate special needs voters. In addition, there were at least 20 cases of voters who were denied the right to vote due to their names not appearing on the voters' register or discrepancies on the voter list, notably in Abobo in the EPP Belleville BV05 and Man in the Lycée Municipal B404. Instances were recorded in 19 polling stations where voters were allowed to cast their ballots without presenting valid identification, often due to clerical errors in the voter register or confusion over the types of accepted identification. These incidents occurred in Adjami in the Abidjan district, in École Primaire Mission Libanaise in the BV01, in Touba in the Woroba district, Municipalité 1, then in Bingerville in the Abidjan district, in the EEP Agriculture BV01, and Gagnoa in the Go-Jiboa district, again in the Lycée Moderne 1 to 2, BV B3 51/52. A notable incident, however, occurred at a polling station in Lolobo Primary School in Lolobo PU1 in the Yamoussoukro district. A large group of masked men, numbering about 30, invaded the polling center, throwing stones and other objects during the voting process, creating panic and disruption of the polls. The situation led to a temporary suspension of voting, and security reinforcements were later deployed, and order was restored, allowing voting to resume safely. Closing and counting of votes. Observers reported that most polling stations closed on schedule and vote counting commenced immediately. Based on the report submitted, 57% of the polling stations visited closed at 6 p.m., while 43% closed after 6 p.m., due mainly to late openings or minor logistical issues encountered earlier at the commencement of polls. In almost all localities visited, closing operations took place in a calm and orderly manner. Security personnel were visible but non-intrusive. Voters who were already in line before the official closing time were allowed to cast their ballots. The counting process was conducted openly in the presence of agents and observers. Most of the teams described the atmosphere as peaceful and orderly. Observers were generally allowed access to observe all stages of the process. Nevertheless, some challenges were noted. In several polling stations, voter participation was reported to be very low. and in some cases, no voters remained at the polling station to witness the counting. The situation was observed in parts of the Lax district, notably Dimbokro in the Nzi region, and the Abidjan district, including Port Boué, and surrounding areas. Also, in a particular polling station in Divo, the GS Bezi Tayoro Lucien polling center, polling unit number 02, in the Low Jibwa region and the Go Jibwa district, our observers reported that they were not permitted to photograph the polling station results after counting, suggesting an isolated restriction on observer access to documentation. Aside from these few issues, no major incidents or disruptions were recorded during the closing and counting phase. Security conditions remained stable throughout, and security agents acted with restraint and professionalism. Preliminary conclusions. The Joint Mission notes that despite punctual and well-coordinated meetings, coordinated openings in most locations, about 1/3 of polling stations experienced avoidable delays stemming from late delivery of election materials, organizational and logistical deficiencies, absence of and late arrivals of election officials, and failure to give prior notice to voters on some relocated centers, leading to late start of polls. In the light of the foregoing, the Joint Mission recommends that the competent authorities ensure overnight delivery of materials and strengthen early morning logistics coordination. They should also establish backup teams to replace late or absent election officials and provide clear communication channels between election supervisors and their field officers. The Joint Mission further recommends strengthening accessibility measures for disabled persons and those for disabled persons, and training polling staff on ballot secrecy and efficient voter management in preparation for the legislative elections coming up later in the year. The mission notes the weak presence of representatives of 4 of the 5 candidates. The mission notes that the legal framework could be further strengthened to regulate the pre-campaign period, the use of state resources during the campaign, and establish control on the use of public and private funding for election campaigns. The Joint Mission further notes the need to integrate agreements emanating from political dialogue processes into national laws. It also calls on ECOWAS and the AU and development partners to intensify support to Côte d'Ivoire in consolidating democracy, peace, and social cohesion through continued dialogue, including in the period leading up to the legislative elections. The joint ECOWAS-AU Election Observation Mission wishes to appeal to all stakeholders, principally the political parties, candidates and their supporters, the security forces and general citizenry, to remain calm and patiently wait for the final announcement and validation of the election results by the competent authorities as required by law. In this regard, the Joint Mission particularly appeals to candidates and political parties to refrain from making any statements that may lead to a breach of the peace. This declaration is done in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, on the 27th of October, 2025. Thank you very much. To prevent constitutional violations that may lead to violent changes in power or illegal changes in power. I think, to be fair, ECOWAS, first of all, has always insisted that the good governance protocols must be followed, and that proper constitutional processes must be followed. That has taken place at all ECOWAS meetings of heads of states, ECOWAS, and all other ECOWAS meetings. The point is very, very frequently made that unconstitutional changes are certainly not acceptable to ECOWAS. Also, of course, illegal or unconstitutional changes to government are also not acceptable. But this is what ECOWAS can do. ECOWAS has persuasive influence. And of course, as you can see, even where that persuasive influence is sought to be enforced, it could lead to the sorts of breakaways that we have seen. So there is no question at all that ECOWAS has maintained its position very clearly, and all countries in the ECOWAS know the position of ECOWAS on all of these issues. But there is no, we also insist that where legal processes, where there are national laws, for example, and where those national laws are clearly stated and they were passed by competent authorities, ECOWAS, generally speaking, will not question those authorities. If a law is passed in a country, passed duly by Parliament as it ought to be passed, if that law happens to be criticized by members of the political community or opposition or whatever, that is entirely their right. But ECOWAS does not have a role in criticizing laws duly passed by competent authorities in the countries, in our member countries. So that's, also I think a point that we ought to make. The last question is on whether or not we engage disqualified candidates. As a matter of fact, what happened up until the eve of the elections, we sought to meet with all of the candidates. Of course, Tijan Thiam is out of the country. We then made the effort to go. As a matter of fact, we established a meeting. We went to the venue, but unfortunately, we were not. They actually invited us after we had established contact with them, but we did not find any officials there. I was there personally to that meeting. I attended that meeting. We were hoping to meet with the officials of the party, even if we couldn't meet with the candidate himself, but we did not find anyone there. Then in the case of former President Babu, we made every effort, through several of his aides and assistants, promised at various times that he would meet with us, but we were unable to meet with him before the eve of the election. We remained open to meeting with him even before, hours before the elections, if that was possible. But as it turns out, that wasn't possible. But we did make all the efforts necessary to meet with him. So those are the... Any other questions?
That's all.
Is that all?
Je pense que c'était les trois questions qui ont été posées.